The Passes of Gelt, Chapter 21 of Shardik by Richard Adams. To burn Gelt had been no part of Tacominion's intention, nor could he find out who had done it, each of the barons denying all knowledge of how or where the fire had begun. Tacominion, with his personal followers, had reached the wretched little square in the centre of the town to find two sides already ablaze, the body of the chief lying with a spear in the back, and a crowd of Ortelgans looting and drinking. He and Zelda, with a handful of the steadier men, beat some sort of order into them, and, there being no water in the place, except what could be scooped from two wells and one shrunken mountain brook, checked the fire by breaking up the huts downwind and dragging away the posts and straw. It was Zelda who pointed out that at all costs they must prevent any of the townspeople from carrying news down to the plain. Guards were set on all roads and paths leading out of the town, while a young man named Jurit, to whom Tacominion had that morning given Fasalhasta's command, led a reconnoitring force down the steep southward road to find out what lay before them. Tacominion sat on a bench in one of the dim, fly-buzzing huts, trying to convince 4 or 5 frightened, speechless town elders that he meant them no harm. From time to time he broke off, frowning and groping for words as the walls swam before his eyes, and the sounds from outside rose and fell in his ears like talk from beyond a door continually opening and closing. He moved restlessly, feeling as though his body were wrapped in stiff ox hides. His wounded forearm throbbed, and there was a tender swelling in his armpit. Opening his eyes, he saw the faces of the old men staring at him, full of wary curiosity. He spoke of Lord Shardik, of the revealed destiny of Ortelga and the sure defeat of Bekla, and saw the dull disbelief and fear of reprisal and death which they could not keep from their eyes. At last one of them, shrewder perhaps than the rest, who must have been calculating the probable effect of what had occurred, to him to say, replied by telling him of the northern army of patrol under General Santalcair Ketlas, which, if he were not mistaken, as well he might be, he added hastily, his cunning peasant's face assuming an expression of humility and deference, was due at this time to cross the plain below on its circuit to Cabin and beyond. Did the young lord mean to fight that army, or would he seek to avoid it? Either way, it seemed best not to remain in Gelt, for the rains were due, were they not, and he broke off, acting the part of one who knew his place and would not presume to advise the commander of so fine an army. Tacominion thanked him gravely, affecting not to be aware that it mattered little to those standing before him whether he went forward or back so long as he left Gelt. If the old man had meant to frighten him, he had reckoned without the blazing faith in Shardik that filled every heart in the Ortelgan army. Probably the elders supposed that he intended only to raid 1 or 2 villages in the plain and then escape back over the hills with his booty, weapons, cattle, and women, covered from pursuit by the onset of the rains. Tacominion, however, had never from the outset intended other than to seek out and destroy all enemy forces, whatever their strength, that might lie between himself and Bekla. His followers, he knew, would be content with nothing less. They meant to fight as soon as possible, since they knew that they could not be defeated. Shardik himself had already shown them what became of his enemies, and to Shardik it would make no difference whether his enemies were treacherous Ortelgan barons or patrolling Beklan soldiers. The thought of the Beklan army, with which the crafty elder of Gelt had thought to dismay him, filled Tacominion only with a fierce and eager joy, restoring him to the willpower to drive on his sick body and feverish mind. Bowing to the old man, he left the hut and paced slowly up and down outside, heedless of the stinking refuse and the scab-mouthed, mucus-eyed children begging among his soldiers. Not for one moment did it occur to him to deliberate whether or not he should fight. Lord Shardik and he himself had already decided upon that. But on him, as Shardik's general, fell the task of deciding when and where. Even this did not occupy him long, for all his thoughts led to one and the same conclusion, that they should march straight on towards Bekla and fight the enemy wherever they might meet him on the open plain. There was scarcely any food to be commandeered in Gelt, and the events of the afternoon had shown him how little real control he had over his men. The rains might come at any hour, and despite Zelda's cordon, the news could not long remain secret that Gelt had fallen to the Ortelgans. More immediate than all these, because he felt it within his own body, was the knowledge that soon he might become incapable of leading the army. Once the battle was won, his illness would matter little, but his collapse before they fought would bring to his men misgiving and superstitious dread. Besides, he alone must command the battle. How else to become Lord of Bekla? Where was the Beklan army now, and how soon could they hope to meet it? The elders had said that the distance to the plain was about a day's march, and he could expect the enemy to seek him out as soon as they had news of him. They would be as eager for battle as himself. In all probability, therefore, he could expect to fight on the plain not later than the day after tomorrow. This must be his plan. He could make no better, could only offer to Lord Shardik his courage and zeal to use as he would. And to Shardik it must remain to delay the rains and bring the Beklans in their path. Where was Shardik, and what, if anything, had Kelderek achieved since he left them? No two ways about it, the fellow was a coward, yet it mattered little, if only he could somehow or other contrive to bring the bear to the army before they fought. If they won, as win they would, if indeed they came at last to take Bekla itself, what would Kelderek's place be then? And the Tuginda, that futile yet disturbing woman, whom he had sent back to Kiso under guard, what was to be done with her? There could be no authority that did not acknowledge his own. Get rid of them both, perhaps, and in some way alter the cult of Shardik accordingly. Later there would be time to decide such things. All that mattered now was the approaching battle. Feeling suddenly faint, he sat down upon the rubble of a burned hut to recover himself. If, he thought, this sickness had not left him by the time the battle was over, he would send for the Tuginda and offer to reinstate her on the condition that she cured him. Meanwhile, he could only rely on Kelderek to exercise authority in her name. But it was important that the fellow should be urged on to complete his task. He stood up, steadied himself against the still-standing doorpost until the surge of giddiness had passed off, and then made his way back to the hut. The elders had left, and, calling his servant Numis, he gave him a brief message to carry to Kelderek, stressing that he expected to fight within 2 days. As soon as he had made sure that the man had his words by heart, he asked Zelda to see to his safe conduct through the pickets, and himself lay down to sleep, giving orders that all was to be ready for the march to continue at dawn next day. He slept heavily, undisturbed by the looting, raping, and drunkenness that broke out again at nightfall, and continued unchecked, none of the barons caring to run the risk of trying to stop it. When at last he woke, he knew at once that he was not merely ill, but worse than he had been in his life before. His arm was so swollen that the bandage was pressing into the flesh, yet he felt that he could not bear to cut it. His teeth chattered, his throat was so sore that he could scarcely swallow, and as he sat up, pain throbbed behind his eyes. He got up and staggered to the door. Gusts of warm wind were blowing from the west, and the sky was thick with low cloud. The sun was not to be seen, but nevertheless he knew that it must be well after dawn. He leant against the wall, trying to summon the strength to go and rouse the men who should have been obeying his orders. It was not until an hour before noon that the army at last set out. Their pace was slow, several of the soldiers having burdened themselves with such loot as they had been able to come by, cooking pots, mattocks, stools, the sorry and valueless possessions of men poorer than themselves. Many marched with aching heads and curdled stomachs. Takominian, no longer able to conceal his illness, walked in a confused and troubled dream. He scarcely remembered what had happened that morning, or what he had done to get the men on their feet. He could recall the return of Numis, with his report that Shardik had been drugged at the cost of a priestess's life. Kelderek, so the message ran, hoped to overtake them by nightfall. The last nightfall, thought Takominian, before the destruction of the Beklan army. When that was done, he would rest. The narrow road wound along the sides of steep wooded ravines, sheltered from the wind, against rock faces where the brown ferns drooped for rain. For a long time the sound of an invisible torrent rose up from below, through mists that swirled hither and back, but dispersed no more than did the cloud above. All was solitude and echo, and soon the men ceased to sing, to jest, or even to talk beyond a few words in low voices. One tattered fellow, loosing an arrow, hit a buzzard as it swooped above them, and, proud of his marksmanship, slung the carcass round his neck until, as the parasites began to creep from the cooling body, he slung it over a precipice with a curse. Once or twice, looking out across the tops of trees, they caught glimpses of the plain below, and of tiny herds of cattle galloping among the windy dust clouds. In superstitious dread of those wild hills they pressed on, many glancing uneasily about them and carrying their weapons drawn in their hands. The straggling horde covered more than 2 miles of the track, and there were no means of passing orders save by word of mouth. Between 2 and 3 hours after noon, however, when they had descended below the mists and the higher hills, a halt took place without any order being given, the several companies and bands coming up to find the vanguard fallen out and resting in an open wood. Takominian limped among the men, talking and joking with them as though in a trance, less to encourage than to let them see him and try to learn for themselves what fettle they were in. Now that they had left the sheer solitudes which had disquieted and subdued them, their ardour was returning, and they seemed as eager as ever to join battle. Yet Takominian, who as a lad of 17 had fought beside Belcatrazet at Clenderzard, and 3 years later commanded the household company which his father had sent to Yelda to fight in the slave wars, could sense how green and unseasoned was their fervour. In one way, he knew, this might be counted to the good, for in their first battle men spend what they can never recover to spend again, so that the battle, even for those for whom it is not the last, may well be their best. But the toll taken of such inexperienced fervour was likely to be high. From such troops little could be expected in the way of disciplined manoeuvre or steadiness under attack. The best way to use their rough, untrained quality would be simply to bring them quickly to the plain and let them assault the enemy in full strength and on open ground. A spasm seized him, and the trees before his eyes dissolved into circling shapes of yellow, green, and brown. Somewhere far off, it seemed, rain was beating on the leaves. He listened, but then realized that the sound lay within his own ear, as full of pain as an egg is full of yolk. He had a fancy to break it open and watch the thick, fluid pain spill over the ground at his feet. Someone was speaking to him. He opened his eyes yet once more and raised his head. It was Kvass, his father's Fletcher, a decent, simple-minded man who had taught him his archery as a boy. With him were 4 or 5 comrades who, or so it seemed to Takominian, had prevailed upon Kvass to come and ask the commander to settle some difference between them. The Fletcher, who was tall as himself, was looking at him with respectful sympathy and pity. In reply he grimaced and then managed to force a wry smile. "Touch of the fever, sir, eh?" said Kvass deferentially. Everything about him, his stance, his look, and the sound of his voice, tended to confirm Takominian in his leadership, and at the same time to emphasize their common humanity. "Seems like it, Kvass," he answered. His words boomed in his own head, but he could not tell whether in fact he was speaking loud or low. "It'll pass off." Clenching his teeth to stop them chattering, he missed what Kvass said next, and was about to turn away when he realized that they were all waiting for him to reply. He remained silent, but looked steadily at Kvass as though expecting him to say something more. Kvass seemed confused. "Well, I only meant, sir, and no disrespect, I'm sure, when he came ashore that morning, when you was with him, whether he told you he'd appear again, like, that he'd be there to make sure we won the battle," said Kvass. Takominian continued to stare at him, guessing at his meaning. The men became uneasy. "Nothing to do with us," muttered one. "I said as 'twas nothing to do with us." "Well, only it's like this, sir," pursued Kvass. "I was one of the first beside you that morning, and when Lord Shardik went over the water, you told us he knew Ortelga was as good as taken, and he was off to Bekla, to show us the way, like. And what the lads was wondering, sir, was whether he's going to be there to win for us when we come to fight." "We're bound to win, aren't we, sir?" said another of the men. "It's the will of Shardik, the will of God." "How do you know?" said a fourth, a surly, sceptical-looking fellow with blackened teeth. He spat on the ground. "Do you think a bear talks, eh? Think a bear talks?" "Not to you," replied Kvass contemptuously. "Of course he don't talk to the likes of you, or me either, for the matter of that. What I told you was that Lord Shardik had said we was to march on Bekla, and that he was going there himself, so it stands to reason he's going to appear when we fight the battle, If you don't place no reliance on Lord Shardik, why are you here?" "Well, it's all according, ain't it?" said the man with the blackened teeth. "He might be there, and then again he might not. All I said was, Bekla's a strong place. There's soldiers. Be quiet," cried Takominian. He walked across to the man as steadily as he was able, took his chin in his hand, and lifted his head as he tried to focus his eyes on his face. "You blasphemous fool! Lord Shardik can hear you now, and see you as well. But you will not see him until the appointed time, for he means to test your faith." The man, 20 years older than Takominian at least, stared back at him sullenly without a word. "You can be sure of this," said Takominian, in a voice that could be heard by everyone nearby. "Lord Shardik intends to fight for those that trust him, and he will appear when they fight. He will appear to those that deserve it, but not to those who deserve a woodlouse for a god." As he stumbled away, he wondered yet again how long Kelderek would need to overtake them. If all went well, it might be possible, while the army encamped that night, to discuss with Kelderek how best they could make use of Shardik. Whatever might be disclosed afterwards by Baltus and the other men who were now with Kelderek, Shardik must appear to the enemy in awe-inspiring power. He must not be displayed insensible and drugged. Also, it would be better to keep him away from the men altogether until he was revealed at the proper time, which would presumably be immediately before the battle. Yet Takominian knew that he himself would not be able to retrace even a mile of the road tonight. If Kelderek did not reach the army, he would have to send Zelda back to find him and speak with him. As for himself, he could not go on much longer without a rest. He must lie down and sleep. But if he did so, would he be able to get up again? The march was resumed, the army following the road through the wood and down the hillside beyond. Takominian took up a place in the middle of the column, knowing that if he remained in the rear he would not be able to keep up. For a time he leaned on Numus's arm until, perceiving that the wretched man was exhausted, he sent for Kvass to take his place. They went on through the darkening, sultry afternoon. Takominian tried to estimate how far ahead the vanguard might be. The distance down to the mile could not now be more than a few miles. He had better send a runner to tell them to halt when they reached it. Just as he was about to call the nearest man, he slipped, jolted his arm, and almost fell down with the pain. Kvass helped him to the side of the track. "I'll never get there, Kvass," he whispered. "Don't worry, sir," replied Kvass. "After what you told the lads, they'd fight just as well, even if you did have to sit it out like. That's got round, you know, sir, what you said back there. Most of them never actually saw Lord Shardik when he came on shore on Artelga, you see, and they're keen to fight just to be there when he shows up again. They know he's coming, so even if you was to have to lay down for a bit." Suddenly, there reached Takominian's ears a confused, distant clamor, echoing up from the steep woods below. The familiar guttural cries of the Ortelgans, and, clearly distinguishable at rhythmic intervals, a higher, lighter sound of other voices shouting together. Underneath all was the thudding, trampling noise of a tumultuous crowd. Takominian knew now that he must be delirious, for evidently he could no longer tell reality from hallucination. Yet Kvass seemed to be listening too. "Can you hear it, Kvass?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Sounds like trouble. Part of that noise isn't our lads, sir." Commotion was working back along the column like a floodwater flowing up a creek from the main river. Men were running past them down the hill, looking back to point and shout to those behind. Takominian tried to call out to them, but none regarded him. Kvass flung himself at a running man, stopped him by main force, held him as he gabbled and pointed, flung him aside, and returned to Takominian. "Can't make it out altogether, sir, but there's some sort of fighting down there, or at least that's what he said." "Fighting?" repeated Takominian. For a few moments he could not remember what the word meant. His vision blurred, and with this came the curious sensation that his eyes had melted and were running down his face, while still retaining, though in a splintered manner, the power of sight. He raised his hand to wipe away the streaming liquid. Sure enough, he could no longer see. Kvass was shouting beside him. "The rain, sir! The rain!" It was indeed rain that was covering his hands, blurring his eyes, and filling the woods with a leafy sibilance that he had supposed to be coming from inside his own head. He stepped into the middle of the track and tried to make out for himself what was going on at the foot of the hill. "Help me to get down there, Kvass," he said. "Steady, sir, steady," replied the Fletcher, taking his arm once more. "Never mind steady," shouted Takaminian. "Those are Becklins down there, Becklins, and our fools are fighting them piecemeal before they're even deployed. Where's Keldrek? The reins! It's that priestess! She's cursed us! Help me down there." "Steady, sir," repeated the man, holding him up. Hobbling, hopping, stumbling, Takaminian plunged down the steep track, the clamour growing louder in his ears until he could plainly discern the clashing of arms and distinguish the cries of warriors and the screams of the wounded. The woodland, he saw, ended at the foot of the hill, and the fighting, which he still could not make out clearly, had been joined in the open beyond. Men with drawn weapons were running back among the trees. He saw a great fair-haired fellow pitch to the ground, blood oozing from a wound in his back. Suddenly Zelda appeared through the leaves, calling to the men about him, and pointing back into the open with his sword. Takaminian shouted and tried to run towards him. As he did so, he felt a sharp, clutching sensation pass through his body, followed by a cold rushing, a crumbling and inward flow. He blundered into a tree trunk and fell his length in the road. As he rolled over, he knew that he could not get up, that he would never get up again. The floodgates of his body had broken, and very soon the flood would cover hearing, sight, and tongue forever. Zelda's face appeared above him, looking down, dripping rain on his own. "What's happened?" asked Takaminian. "Becklins," answered Zelda. "Fewer than we, but they're taking no chances. The ground's in their favor, and they're simply standing and blocking the road." "The Becklins! How did they get up here? Listen, everyone must attack at the same time," whispered Takaminian. "If only they would. There's no order. They're going for them all anyhow, just as they happen to come up. There's some have had enough already, but others are still out there. It'll be dark in less than an hour, and now the rain. Get them all back under the trees. Reform. Attack again," gasped Takaminian, contriving to utter the words with an enormous effort. His mind was drifting into a mist. It did not surprise him to find that Zelda had gone, and that he was once more facing the Tuginda on the road to Gelt. She said nothing, only standing submissively, her wrists tied together with a soaked and filthy bandage. Her eyes were gazing past him at the hills, and first he thought that she must be unaware of his presence. Then, with a conclusive and skeptical glance, like that of some shrewd peasant woman in the market, she looked into his face and raised her eyebrows, as much as to say, "And have you finished now, my child?" "You woman!" cried Takaminian. "I'll strangle you!" He wrenched at the bandage, and the deep, suppurating wound along his sword arm, which for more than 2 days had been pouring poison into his body, burst open upon the rain-pitted dust of the track where he lay. For a moment he jerked his head up, then fell back and opened his eyes, crying, "Zelda!" But it was Keldrek whom he saw bending over him.